The burden in the old garage. On a freezing winter evening, the two-story suburban house belonging to David glowed with warm golden light, while snow drifted quietly across the empty street outside. Inside the brightly lit dining room, the sound of silverware striking porcelain plates mixed with tense voices and exhausted sighs. David, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and streaks of gray spreading through his hair, slammed a thick stack of papers onto the dining table with visible frustration. Another warning from the bank. They said they will begin foreclosure proceedings if I do not pay the remaining mortgage balance and the property taxes before the end of this month. His voice cracked with anger as he dragged a trembling hand through his hair. Across from him sat his younger sister Sarah, recently divorced and emotionally drained from months of financial disaster. Her red, swollen eyes remained fixed on the hospital bill trembling in her hands, the unpaid balance from her heart surgery continuing to grow with interest every week. "You think you are the only one suffering?" Sarah whispered bitterly. "The hospital called me again this morning. If I cannot pay the rest of the medical bills soon, they will transfer my debt to a collection agency. I do not even know how I will pay Leo's school tuition next semester." The atmosphere inside the dining room thickened with hopelessness and silent panic. Every corner of the beautiful house carried the weight of hidden debt, fear, and exhaustion. None of them noticed the slow, fragile figure approaching quietly from the back door leading to the kitchen. It was Mary, their widowed mother. She wore an old hand-knitted sweater faded from decades of washing and years of use. The fabric hung loosely over her thin shoulders, and her worn cloth shoes carried traces of mud and melting snow from the path leading to the garage behind the house. Her trembling hands held a basket of freshly folded laundry pressed carefully against her chest. "David, Sarah," Mary spoke softly, her voice weak and fragile, like dry paper trembling in the wind. "I made some tomato soup downstairs near the stove. I thought maybe you and little Leo might want something warm tonight." "Mother, we are not in the mood for soup right now," David interrupted sharply without even looking at her. "Can you not see we are drowning in financial problems? Please just stay out of the way tonight. And stop walking through the main house when we are discussing important matters. You brought mud from the garage floor all over the kitchen again." Mary immediately lowered her eyes toward her old shoes. "I am sorry," she whispered quietly. "I only wanted to bring the laundry upstairs so it could dry somewhere warm. The garage is very cold tonight." Sarah leaned back in her chair with visible irritation and emotional exhaustion covering her face. "You will just have to deal with it, Mother. This house does not have any extra rooms anymore. Ever since Father died, none of us have had enough money for ourselves, let alone another person. We already feed you and let you stay here. We are doing everything we can just to survive." In the eyes of her children, Mary had become nothing more than a helpless old woman with no income, no value, and no purpose beyond being another financial burden added to their collapsing lives. Sarah's words cut deeply into the heart of the elderly mother standing quietly near the kitchen doorway. Mary said nothing in response. She simply tightened her arms around the basket of folded clothes and slowly turned toward the back door. Outside, the bitter winter wind screamed through the darkness as the door closed behind her, separating two completely different worlds. The warm, comfortable house filled with resentment and emotional distance, and the freezing, lonely garage where the forgotten mother continued to live alone. Desperation and silent miracles. Long after midnight, while the warm lights inside David's house slowly disappeared one by one, the old garage behind the backyard remained swallowed by darkness and bitter cold. The small garage had once been used to store broken furniture, gardening tools, and dusty cardboard boxes filled with forgotten memories from better years. Now, it had been cleared just enough to become a temporary sleeping space for Mary. A narrow folding bed stood pressed against the uninsulated wall, while rusty gardening equipment leaned silently in the corners beneath cobwebs and layers of dust. The freezing winter air slipped through every crack in the old wooden structure, cutting through the room like invisible knives. Mary trembled beneath a thin, worn blanket, slowly pulling it closer to her chest as the wind rattled the garage door outside. Beside her bed sat a small wooden table holding a faded photograph of her late husband. Under the weak yellow glow of a flickering lamp, Mary reached out with her wrinkled, trembling hand and gently touched the smiling face inside the photograph. "Can you see them?" she whispered softly into the darkness. "The children are struggling so much. David is about to lose the house. Sarah cannot pay her hospital bills. Little Leo may have to leave school soon. I do not know what else to do." Her fragile voice cracked as tears rolled slowly down her weathered cheeks. For a moment, she sat motionless in silence, listening to the cold wind outside and the distant hum of traffic somewhere beyond the sleeping neighborhood. Then something inside her changed. The sadness in her tired eyes slowly hardened into determination. With visible effort, Mary pushed aside the blanket and knelt carefully beside the bed before pulling open a small drawer hidden underneath the folding frame. From inside, she removed an old rust-stained metal box, wrapped carefully in a faded cloth towel. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it. There were no bars of gold or hidden treasures sparkling inside like the dramatic stories people often imagined. Instead, the box contained neatly flattened stacks of small bills, several carefully saved coins, a worn savings account booklet carrying her name, and one final precious object resting quietly beneath everything else. It was her wedding ring, a thin golden band holding a tiny diamond that reflected the dim yellow light of the lamp. Mary stared at the ring for several long seconds. It was not simply jewelry. It was the final piece of the life she once shared with the man she had loved for more than 40 years. She reached for a pencil and several folded papers before carefully writing numbers beneath the weak light. David's overdue mortgage payment, $2,000. Sarah's hospital debt, $3,500. Leo's school tuition, $1,200. Mary slowly opened the savings booklet and stared at the remaining balance. It was not enough. Not even close. Her eyes drifted back toward the wedding ring, resting silently inside the metal box. She picked it up carefully and ran her thumb across the tiny diamond. Memories flooded through her mind. Her husband placing the ring on her finger decades earlier, their first apartment, sleepless nights raising children, family dinners, birthdays, Christmas mornings, and promises whispered long ago beneath younger skies. A soft, painful smile slowly appeared on her face. "I am sorry," she whispered quietly toward the photograph of her husband. "But the children need this more than we do now." The following morning, after David and Sarah left the house, Mary quietly put on her oldest winter coat and wrapped a scarf tightly around her neck before stepping outside into the falling snow. The icy wind pushed against her fragile body as she slowly walked more than 2 miles toward the center of town. Her old shoes became soaked from melted snow, but she continued forward without complaint. Inside her coat pocket rested the wedding ring. That day marked the beginning of a silent plan. Mary began selling the last valuable things she owned, collecting small jobs wherever she could find them, saving every dollar, and sacrificing the little comfort she still had in order to protect a family that barely noticed her existence anymore. David and Sarah believed the elderly woman sleeping in the garage was nothing more than another burden dragging them closer toward collapse. They did not know that the quiet, forgotten widow shivering behind the house was slowly becoming the only wall standing between them and complete destruction, the cold funeral. Winter arrived harder than ever that year, covering the town in endless gray skies and freezing winds that rattled the windows of every house along the quiet suburban streets. Inside the old garage behind David's home, the cold became unbearable. The thin folding bed stood against the uninsulated wall, while weak moonlight slipped through the cracks in the wooden panels. Mary lay beneath her worn blanket, coughing softly into the darkness, her frail body weaker than it had ever been before. Over the past several months, she had grown noticeably thinner. Her hands trembled constantly from exhaustion and the long hours she spent walking through town searching for temporary work, collecting recyclable cans, and quietly selling the few belongings she still owned. Yet, despite her worsening condition, she never complained. Every time David received another mysterious bank payment notice showing part of his debt had been covered, he called it luck. Every time Sarah discovered another hospital bill had somehow been paid anonymously, she thanked charitable assistance programs without questioning anything further. Neither of them noticed that Mary's old wedding ring had disappeared from her finger. Neither of them noticed how little food she ate, how pale her face had become, or how difficult it was for her to climb the small wooden steps leading from the garage to the backyard. One freezing evening, heavy snow began falling across the neighborhood while icy winds screamed outside the garage walls. Inside the main house, David sat comfortably in front of the television while Sarah prepared dinner in the kitchen. Leo laughed quietly upstairs while playing video games in his bedroom. No one thought about Mary sitting alone only a few yards away in the freezing darkness. That night, Mary struggled to breathe. Her chest tightened painfully with every shallow breath while cold air filled the garage around her. She slowly reached toward the small table beside her bed, where the faded photograph of her late husband still rested beneath the weak yellow lamp. Her wrinkled fingers touched the picture gently, one final time. "I think I am tired now," she whispered weakly into the empty room. "I hope I did enough for them." Outside, snow continued falling silently across the backyard. Inside the garage, the lamp beside Mary's bed flickered softly as her eyes slowly closed. By morning, the garage had become completely silent. David discovered her several hours later, after noticing she had not come inside to collect the laundry hanging near the kitchen. He opened the garage door with visible irritation, already preparing to complain about the freezing air entering the house. But the moment he stepped inside, he stopped moving. Mary remained lying quietly beneath the blanket, her pale hands folded gently across her chest. The photograph of her husband rested beside her while snowlight filtered weakly through the cracked garage window. For several seconds, David simply stood there frozen in silence. Sarah arrived moments later and covered her mouth in shock. Yet even inside that moment of tragedy, there remained something distant and emotionally detached between them and the woman who had spent her final years living behind their house. The funeral took place 3 days later beneath a cloudy winter sky. Only a handful of people attended. An elderly neighbor stood quietly near the back row while the local pastor spoke brief words about kindness, motherhood, and sacrifice. David wore a black coat and checked his phone several times during the service. Sarah remained emotionally exhausted, distracted more by unpaid bills and personal problems than grief itself. Leo barely understood what was happening at all. There were no large flower arrangements, no emotional speeches, and no long line of mourners honoring Mary's life. The ceremony felt cold, rushed, and painfully empty. After the burial, David exhaled heavily while standing beside his car in the cemetery parking lot. "At least she is finally at peace now," he muttered quietly, though deep inside another thought lingered beneath the surface. One less responsibility, one less expense, one less burden to carry. Sarah nodded silently beside him. Neither of them realized how cruel their relief sounded beneath the gray winter sky. As they drove away from the cemetery, the small grave behind them disappeared beneath falling snow, while the cold wind swept through the silent rows of tombstones. The old woman they once considered useless had left the world almost exactly as she had lived during her final years. Quietly, alone, and largely unnoticed. Yet hidden behind that lonely ending was a truth neither of her children had discovered yet. A truth powerful enough to change everything they believed about the fragile mother they had abandoned inside the freezing garage. The metal box and the receipts. Several days after Mary's funeral, the winter storm finally passed, leaving the neighborhood covered beneath thick layers of dirty, melting snow. Life inside David's house slowly returned to normal, or at least what they considered normal. The television played constantly in the living room, Unpaid bills still covered the kitchen counter, and the tension surrounding money continued hanging over the family like a permanent shadow. Yet something strange had begun happening again. Another mortgage payment notification arrived from the bank showing that a large portion of David's overdue balance had mysteriously been covered. 2 days later, Sarah received a phone call from the hospital informing her that the remaining balance on her surgery debt had been completely paid in full. Even Leo's school administration sent an email confirming that the next semester tuition had already been handled anonymously. At first, David laughed in disbelief while staring at the documents spread across the dining table. "This has to be some kind of mistake," he muttered quietly. Sarah grabbed the hospital statement with trembling hands and reread the words over and over again. No outstanding balance remaining. Her breathing became uneven. Who would pay all of this for us? Neither of them had an answer. They searched through old emails, previous assistance applications, charity requests, and bank notices, hoping to discover where the mysterious money had come from. Nothing explained it. 3 mornings later, a black sedan slowly pulled into the driveway shortly after sunrise. David looked through the living room window and frowned when he saw 2 unfamiliar people stepping out of the vehicle. One was a middle-aged lawyer carrying a leather briefcase, while the other wore a dark winter coat with the silver identification badge of the local bank attached to his chest. David opened the front door cautiously as the 2 strangers approached the porch. "Mr. David Harper?" the lawyer asked politely. "Yes, my name is Thomas Reed. I handled several private financial matters for your mother, Mary Harper." David immediately looked confused. "My mother?" Sarah appeared behind him in the hallway, listening silently. The lawyer nodded slowly. "There are some documents she instructed us to deliver after her passing." The bank representative stepped forward and handed David several official folders stamped with payment confirmations and property records. "Your mother made multiple anonymous payments toward your mortgage debt over the last 3 years," he explained calmly, "including property taxes and foreclosure prevention installments." David stared at the man without speaking. The lawyer then opened his briefcase and carefully removed a small rust-stained metal box with an old combination lock attached to the front. Sarah immediately recognized it. "That was in her garage," she whispered softly. Thomas Reed nodded again. "Your mother asked us to ensure you received this personally." David slowly accepted the heavy metal box into his hands. It felt colder than the winter air itself. "What is inside?" he asked quietly. "Your mother said the contents would explain everything," the lawyer answered. The living room became completely silent as David carried the box toward the dining table. Sarah stood beside him while Leo watched nervously from the staircase. David carefully turned the fragile combination lock until it clicked open with a dull metallic sound. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then he slowly lifted the lid. There were no gold bars hidden inside. No diamonds, no secret inheritance. No fortune waiting to transform their lives overnight. Instead, the box contained hundreds of carefully organized receipts, bank statements, tuition invoices, hospital payment confirmations, tax documents, and handwritten records tied together with old rubber bands. Sarah reached inside first with shaking hands and unfolded one of the papers. Her face immediately lost color. "St. Joseph Medical Center," she whispered weakly. "Final heart surgery payment completed." Below the statement was the name of the person who had paid the balance, Mary Harper. Sarah grabbed another receipt, then another. Every single hospital payment over the past 2 years carried the same name. David quickly pulled out a thick collection of mortgage documents from beneath the stack. Each foreclosure prevention payment, every overdue property tax installment, every emergency transfer protecting the family home from repossession had been paid under Mary's name. His breathing suddenly became shallow. Leo slowly picked up a school tuition statement from the table. "Dad," he whispered quietly, "Grandma paid my school bills too." The room fell into stunned silence. Hidden beneath the receipts was a small handwritten notebook filled with Mary's careful, fragile writing. Inside were pages of calculations, payment schedules, overdue balances, and tiny notes beside each family member's name. David mortgage payment this month. Sarah hospital debt before collection agency deadline. Leo tuition before semester registration closes. Every page revealed another sacrifice, another hidden payment, another piece of her quiet suffering. Sarah's hands began shaking uncontrollably as tears filled her eyes. "This cannot be real," she whispered. She barely had anything. The lawyer slowly removed several final documents from the bottom of the metal box. "Your mother liquidated her personal savings account approximately 18 months ago," he explained gently. "She also sold several personal possessions, including jewelry." Sarah suddenly covered her mouth in horror as realization crashed into her. "Her wedding ring," she whispered painfully. "She stopped wearing it months ago." Thomas Reed nodded silently. The ring sale covered a large portion of the hospital debt. David collapsed slowly into his chair while staring at the endless stack of receipts covering the table in front of him. His mind replayed every cruel conversation, every impatient interruption, every moment he had treated his mother like an unwanted burden living behind the house. The freezing garage, the thin blanket, the tomato soup she offered while they pushed her away, the muddy shoes, the loneliness, all while she secretly sacrificed the final pieces of her own life to save theirs. Sarah broke down first. A painful sob escaped her chest as tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. "We left her alone out there," she cried. "She was selling everything she had for us, and we left her alone in that garage." David could not speak. His eyes remained locked on one final receipt resting near the bottom of the box. It was dated only 2 weeks before Mary's death. Another mortgage payment. Another sacrifice made quietly in silence, while her body slowly failed in the freezing cold behind the very house she had spent her last savings protecting. For the first time in many years, the house became completely silent, not because the financial problems had disappeared, but because the terrible truth had finally entered the room. The woman they believed was weak, useless, and dependent had secretly been carrying the entire family on her fragile shoulders all along. The verdict of conscience. After the lawyer and the bank representative finally left the house, silence settled heavily across every room, like a punishment that could no longer be escaped. The metal box remained open on the dining table, surrounded by stacks of receipts, payment confirmations, handwritten calculations, and fading documents carrying Mary's name. Outside, melting snow dripped slowly from the roof, while weak afternoon light filtered through the windows. But inside the house, the air felt colder than the garage Mary had died in only days earlier. David remained frozen in his chair, unable to look away from the evidence spread across the table before him. Every receipt felt like another accusation. Every document carried proof of a sacrifice he had never noticed. His mother had not been living off their kindness. She had been silently destroying herself to protect them, while they complained about feeding her and giving her a place to sleep. Sarah sat motionless beside the table, with tears running endlessly down her face. Her chest tightened painfully every time she remembered the coldness in her own voice. "We already do enough for you. You are just another burden. Please stay out of the way." The words repeated inside her mind over and over again, like a cruel echo she could no longer... Silence. Leo slowly walked toward the garage door at the back of the kitchen. Without speaking, he opened it carefully and stared across the snowy backyard toward the small building where his grandmother had spent her final years alone. For the first time, he truly saw it. The broken wooden walls, the weak roof covered with frost, the tiny window where pale yellow light once glowed late into the night while Mary secretly calculated bills she could barely afford to pay. "She was freezing out there," Leo whispered quietly. Nobody answered him because nobody could deny it anymore. David finally stood from the table and slowly walked toward the garage. His legs felt heavy with shame. The cold air hit his face as he opened the old wooden door and stepped inside. Everything remained exactly as Mary had left it. The thin blanket still rested neatly across the folding bed. Her old sweater hung beside the wall. The The small wooden table still held the faded photograph of her husband beneath the weak yellow lamp. David stared at the room in silence while guilt crushed the air from his lungs. This tiny, freezing space had been his mother's entire world while he sat inside the warm house complaining about money she was secretly paying for him. His trembling hand reached toward the photograph on the table. For the first time in years, David broke completely. Tears filled his eyes as painful sobs escaped his chest. "I am sorry," he whispered weakly into the empty garage. "Mother, I am so sorry." Back inside the house, Sarah opened the small notebook again and continued reading the fragile handwritten pages. Beside almost every payment, Mary had left tiny personal notes written only for herself. "David works too hard. He must be exhausted. Sarah should focus on recovering from surgery. Leo deserves to stay in school." There was not a single bitter sentence anywhere in the notebook. Not one complaint, not one expression of anger. Even after being pushed into the garage and treated like a burden, Mary's thoughts had remained focused only on protecting the people who hurt her. That realization shattered something deep inside both of her children. The punishment they now faced was not legal, financial, or public humiliation. It was something far worse. They had to live with the knowledge that the person they neglected most had loved them more than anyone else ever would. Days passed, but the house never felt the same again. David stopped eating at the dining table because every chair reminded him of the night Mary stood there offering tomato soup while he rejected her. Sarah could barely sleep after discovering how many nights her mother had walked through snowstorms to make anonymous payments for her medical treatment. Even Leo quietly placed one of his grandmother's old blankets across the folding bed in the garage because he could not stop imagining how cold she must have felt during her final winter. Eventually, David made one final decision. On the first warm morning after the snow began melting, he carried Mary's photograph from the garage into the main house and placed it at the center of the living room above the fireplace. Beneath it, he carefully placed the small metal box filled with receipts and folded papers, not as a symbol of money, not as proof of debt, but as a reminder of the invisible sacrifices that often go unnoticed until it is too late. From that day forward, nobody inside the house ever referred to Mary as a burden again, because the terrible truth had become impossible to escape. The fragile elderly woman they left alone in the freezing garage had quietly carried the entire family on her shoulders until her final breath. And by the time her children finally understood the depth of her love, the only thing left for them was regret. The greatest punishment in life is not losing money, a house, or success. The greatest punishment is realizing too late that the person you failed to value was the one who loved you the most. The spring after her death. Winter finally loosened its grip on the town as the first signs of spring slowly appeared across the neighborhood. Dirty piles of melting snow disappeared from sidewalks. Weak sunlight returned to the streets each morning, and small green leaves began growing along the trees outside David's house. But inside the home, nothing truly felt alive anymore. The silence Mary left behind had settled into every room like an invisible presence nobody could escape. Weeks passed, yet the family continued living beneath the crushing weight of guilt and realization. David no longer spent evenings watching television in the living room. Instead, he often sat alone at the dining table staring at the metal box filled with receipts and payment records, replaying old memories inside his mind. He remembered every moment he ignored his mother's trembling voice, every impatient sigh when she walked too slowly through the kitchen, every cruel sentence spoken during stressful nights when money problems consumed the family. Those memories no longer felt small. They felt unbearable. Sarah changed even more after Mary's death. One afternoon, she quietly entered the garage carrying several cleaning supplies and boxes. For hours, she remained inside alone, wiping dust from the shelves, folding Mary's blankets carefully, organizing the old cardboard containers, and repairing the broken lamp beside the folding bed. As sunlight streamed through the tiny garage window, Sarah suddenly stopped after discovering a small notebook hidden beneath one of the storage boxes. It was different from the financial notebook found inside the metal box. This one, contained personal journal entries written by Mary during the final years of her life. Sarah slowly opened the first page with trembling hands. Today, Leo smiled at me while leaving for school. He reminds me so much of David when he was young. Another page read, Sarah looked tired tonight. I wish I could help her more. Page after page carried only love, concern, and hope for the family who had slowly pushed her aside. Not once did Mary describe herself as abandoned. Not once did she complain about the garage, the loneliness, or the cold. The deeper Sarah read, the harder she cried. Then, she reached one final unfinished page written only days before Mary died. If something happens to me soon, I hope the children never blame themselves too much. They are tired, afraid, and carrying burdens I never wanted them to carry alone. I only wanted to help them quietly while I still could. Sarah completely broke down after reading those words. The woman they neglected until her final breath had spent her last days protecting even their guilt. That evening, Sarah carried the journal into the house and placed it gently in front of David. Neither of them spoke for a long time after reading the final page together. Outside, warm spring rain tapped softly against the windows, while the house remained filled with painful silence. Days later, David made another unexpected decision. He hired workers to completely renovate the old garage. The cracked walls were repaired, insulation was added, the broken floorboards were replaced, and sunlight finally entered the room through larger windows. But the space was not transformed into another storage room or guest bedroom. Instead, David turned it into a small community shelter for elderly women struggling alone in the town. A simple wooden sign appeared outside the building several weeks later. Mary's place. Sarah began volunteering there every weekend, helping prepare meals and organize clothing donations for older women who had nowhere else to go. Leo often sat beside them, listening quietly to stories from lonely grandmothers abandoned by their own families. Slowly, the family began understanding something Mary had known all along. Loneliness could destroy people long before hunger or poverty ever could. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after Mary's death, David stood quietly inside the shelter watching sunlight pour through the windows where cold darkness once lived. Elderly women laughed softly together while drinking tea near the corner table. Warm blankets rested across comfortable chairs. Fresh flowers stood beside Mary's old photograph near the entrance. For the first time since the funeral, David felt something shift inside his chest. Not happiness, not forgiveness, but purpose. He finally understood that guilt alone could never honor his mother's memory. Only kindness could. That evening, as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the neighborhood rooftops, David walked outside and stood silently beside the small garden behind the garage. Spring flowers moved gently in the wind, while golden light filled the backyard. Mary once crossed alone every night. "You saved all of us," he whispered quietly toward the fading sky. "And we never even saw it." The wind moved softly through the trees above him as evening settled over the house. But for the first time in many years, the old garage no longer felt like a place of abandonment. It had become something else entirely. A place where one forgotten woman's silent love continued healing people long after she was gone. There are people in this world who spend their entire lives loving quietly. They wake up early so others can sleep peacefully. They hide their pain so others can smile comfortably. They carry burdens in silence because they believe protecting the people they love matters more than being understood. Mary Harper was one of those people. She never stood in the center of the room demanding attention. She never reminded her children about the sacrifices she made. She never asked anyone to praise her, thank her, or repay her kindness. Instead, she chose to love in the quietest and most painful way possible, by giving away pieces of her own life so the people around her could continue living theirs. While her children slept in warm bedrooms, she froze alone inside a garage. While they complained about debt and fear, she sold the last treasures connected to her memories and her marriage. While they slowly began seeing her as a burden, she continued seeing them as the reason she still wanted to wake up every morning. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth about love. The people who love us the deepest are often the ones we notice the least. We become so distracted by stress, money, pride, and daily problems that we forget to look carefully at the quiet souls standing beside us. Sometimes, a mother's love becomes so constant that her sacrifice turns invisible. Sometimes, the people carrying the heaviest emotional weight are the ones nobody asks about anymore. By the time David and Sarah finally understood the truth, they could no longer apologize properly. There would be no second chance dinner, no warm conversation beside the kitchen table, no opportunity to move her back inside the house. All that remained was an empty garage, a metal box full of receipts, and the unbearable weight of regret. And maybe that is why stories like this hurt so deeply. Because somewhere inside them lives a fear many people secretly carry, the fear of realizing too late who truly loved us. If this story touched your heart, let it become more than just another video you watched before moving on with your day. Let it remind you to look closer at the people who quietly continue loving you without conditions. Call your mother, visit your father, sit beside your grandmother a little longer. Ask how they are truly feeling before life steals the chance away forever. One day, every family dinner ends. Every voice becomes a memory. Every empty chair begins telling a story nobody can change anymore. Do not wait until silence is all that remains before realizing the value of the people who spent their lives protecting yours. Because sometimes the greatest tragedy is not losing someone. The greatest tragedy is finally understanding their love, only after they are gone forever.
Thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to subscribe my channel.